useful to talk about performance management in the context of behavior change, because psychology can tell us a lot about how and when and why we change behavior. And really, when we're talking about performance management, that's one of the key issues we really want is behavior change or behavior continuity if performance is good. But there's been a lot of discussion lately, because we're all in a kind of temporary limbo lockdown of different circumstances, working from home, different working arrangements, business uncertainty, economic uncertainty, all of that. But as we get weeks and months into different situation, different circumstance, new normal, then we really need to look at long-term behavior change in the context of performance management. Because after a few weeks or a few months, behavior change tends to get permanent quite quickly. So we know after changing behavior temporarily, even after about 3 weeks, temporary behavior change starts to become a habit. It tends to be consistent learned pattern behavior instead of out of the ordinary. And that only takes 3 weeks. If you're doing something regularly, consistently for 3 weeks, it's starting to become a habit. And then after 2 or 3 months, short-term behavior change actually becomes a long-term pattern. And it becomes very, very difficult to change after about 2 or 3 months. So if you've been in the same habit, the same work, the same routine for 2 or 3 months, what you're doing now is becoming a lot more likely to be what you're going to be doing in a year, or how you do it, the routine you do it, the style you do it in. So for anyone picking up bad habits, or any people who are responsible for managing other people's performance, noticing bad habits, in the first week or two of a very different circumstance or environment or different behavior, we might see a bit of change, variation, and instability. But after a couple of weeks, that behavior starts to get very consistent. And if you're seeing consistent behavior for 3 weeks, it's really becoming a pattern. And if we're talking about performance conversations, especially underperformance, if you're seeing 3, 4, 5 weeks of underperformance, it's getting to be time where you have to have a discussion about that. Because we're still at the point where that behavior is becoming typical, it's becoming a habit, but it's not kind of firmly entrenched behavior yet, but it doesn't take that much longer, right? So anyone knows from if they're giving up smoking or trying to give up a vice, is if you can do it for 3 weeks, that's pretty good. But if you can do it for 2 or 3 months, you're getting pretty close to set. That's kind of the window of making temporary behavior change permanent. So if we're looking at performance management, and managing people's bad habits or good habits at work, because you want to reinforce the good habits and the good behaviors and really encourage that, recognize the good habits and good behaviors, but discuss the bad ones. Because going into 2 or 3 months, those behaviors, even though it's extraordinary circumstances or exceptional circumstances, once we get into the 2 or 3 month mark, that behavior change is going to be a long-term problem if it's not changed soon. So if someone's performance isn't good, there is a level of sensitivity and care and understanding you have to have for their personal environment, and definitely ask them about what's going on and what's causing the behavior, but don't put those performance management conversations off any longer, because at this point, realistically, they have to happen now or they're going to be much more difficult to have. The behavior is going to be so much more difficult to change down the road. And if we look at best practice for changing behaviors and having good performance conversations, one of the things we should do is talk to people and ask them about what's going on. The first thing is, if someone's in a different environment, different situation, it's extraordinary or exceptional for everyone, they may not be aware that their performance isn't what's required. Whether it's because, they're working from home and they're not necessarily aware or acknowledging what other people's levels of performance are, or how much work anyone else needs to be doing or is doing. So have that conversation about what the expected levels of performance are, why and when, and how you're measuring that. It shouldn't be subjective. It needs to be an objective description and a really clear description that someone can meet. So if you're saying your performance needs to be here, you need to say, here's how we're measuring it, how we're looking at, and here's how you can do that. So you need to have that conversation, but give people a lot of opportunity to describe why that's happening. Because one of the interesting things and one of the helpful things, if people can explain why their performance isn't good or what's been going on, is that there's all sorts of things you might be able to do to help them improve their performance or give them the opportunity to change it. Right? So in some cases, when people are working from home, it's because they don't have the right tools or technology or equipment to get their job done. Right? If someone has a really slow internet connection, that's going to impact their productivity for almost everything they do if they're online for all of their work. If they don't have the right software, or if they're using software that isn't really as good as what they should be doing, if they don't have full access to company documents or information, then maybe you need to find a way for them to be able to get it quickly and easily. If there's communication problems with with other people in the office or with, other people on their team, that may be something you need to look at. If it's something in their own home circumstances, then that might be something that you can talk about looking at longer term solutions or longer term ways to change that. So if they're in a difficult situation right now that is not possible to change, but you can see change in the long term and you can see how, why, and when that will change, and there's a clear plan to get there, then maybe you need to be a bit more sympathetic and give people a bit more time to say, okay, I understand that this behavior is because of this reason, and here's what needs to change to improve performance, but it can't happen right now. Or it's not realistic to expect it under these circumstances. But if you have that discussion, you know what's causing the behavior change, and you know what needs to happen to improve the performance. So in those cases, it may be about giving some more time or accommodation or looking at the long-term plan instead of medium-term plan, right? Because if all of a sudden everything's going to change again in another 2 months, we're looking at changing those temporary behavior patterns instead of that long-term entrenched behavior. So from a manager or HR's perspective, it should be about finding out what's wrong and figuring out if there's something that can be changed from the organization or the team perspective, if there's something that that person can or needs to change. And if there's something that can't change right now, it's a question of, can we wait? Can we figure out how to make this work in the long term? Or in some cases, it's just not tenable, it's not going to work, and that person's performance will never be what's required for the work, which in that case, it makes the conversation more difficult, but at least you're giving people kind of realistic, reliable, and honest feedback about what needs to happen. And then everyone involved in that can make the decision of the consequences of what goes on if the performance doesn't improve.